But what about the few characters that were neither one nor the other, to say nothing of the sheep of England?
You know, once you take away the protagonists and the antagonists, there's not really a whole lot left. The most prominent character in this category is Gordon Dietrich. In the movie, he's played by Stephen Fry, and while we don't see a whole lot of the character, his performance is very emotionally compelling. The movie makes us care about his character in ways that the book does not. So even though his appearance is brief, his character carries a lot of weight, and it draws us that much more into the government's cruelty.
Plus, his connection with Evie is more clearly defined. In the book, he's just kind of this random guy who takes her in and sleeps with her. I really like the relationship that they develop in the movie. But with this category, what we're really talking about is the portrayal of the general population of England, which is totally blown away by the movie. The book's focus is more on the people in the government versus the people fighting the government. We still see the various forces manipulating and persuading the people, and we see their reactions somewhat distantly, but there's no real focus on the people themselves and what they're going through and what they're thinking. In the movie, we continuously see shots from bars, living rooms, and other places in England. And we see the people go from the sheep that let Sutler take over to the people who realize that they must stand up for themselves. In the book, they pretty much just remain sheep, but they start following the anarchists blindly as opposed to the fascists. The movie's message, to me, is stronger largely because of its focus on people. So as far as the other characters are concerned, the movie easily wins.
But how about the composition, the putting together of a graphic novel as opposed to a movie? The literal composition of a graphic novel is fairly traditional, but it does work pretty well. The point of the novel's layout was to tell this rather complex story, and for that kind of thing, I think it's best to keep layouts fairly straightforward. If you draw the reader too much, especially with a story this complex, you might end up losing them. And the novel balances this very well, managing to keep you guessing without disorienting you. The movie also structures things really well. In fact, it often structures things in such a way that it actually resembles a traditional graphic novel. What it really comes down to then is the structure of the story. Both book and movie have pretty complex stories to tell, but the movie's is a little more straightforward. It's pretty easy to follow without juggling a whole lot of plot lines like the book does. To be honest, the book can actually be a little hard to follow on a first read-through.
But it's not so hard to follow that the reader loses interest or patience with the story. And, as with a lot of stories, the complexity of the plot is one of the things that I like about it. There are a lot of plots going as we follow the different members of government and their personal vendettas, Evie and Finch and their personal vendettas, and of course V and his vendetta. The way that these stories are interwoven is just brilliant, and it all comes together in a very satisfying way. I also like the way that the story is divided. It's in 3 parts, and each part focuses on a different aspect of V's revolution. The movie just kind of schmoozes them all together, and while that does make the story more compact, it also doesn't allow for quite as much build-up. The book really does a great job of meticulously showing us each domino as it's set. In the end, the combination of a simple literal structure and a complicated story structure make this an incredibly compelling book to read.
But what about the images on the page versus the images on the screen? So obviously, imagery means something a little bit different in this review than it normally does, because both book and movie represent a visual medium. Both of them use high contrast and darkness to great effect, and each incarnation uses imagery to enhance the story really, really well. The artwork for the graphic novel was done primarily by David Lloyd, who really creates an atmosphere of darkness and despair. Occasionally, the high contrast can get a little muddy, and the male characters look a little too much alike, which can make it a little hard to tell who's who when you're still learning names and faces. But overall, the artwork for the novel is very good, and we really get a feeling of how gritty and unpleasant everything is.
The movie imagery is fascinating to me because so much of it looks like a graphic novel itself. They shoot it in such a way that you feel like you're going from panel to panel. You've got disconcerting close-ups, odd camera angles, and some interesting things done with color. All to make it feel as though this is truly the graphic novel come to life. In fact, David Lloyd himself has said how much he likes the look of the movie because of how exciting it is to see his pictures living up on the screen. It makes this movie not only a great story, but an enjoyable viewing experience. But remember, though the graphic novel is a visual medium, it's a textual medium as well. Descriptions add a lot to the atmosphere created by the pictures. especially the insights into the psyches of various characters, particularly characters like Finch or Adam Susan. These are insights that are not nearly as easy to accomplish in a purely visual medium, and for that matter, not a purely textual medium either. Alan Moore and David Lloyd took full advantage of text and visuals to present us with these complex characters and situations.
However, I think what it decides for me is the way the government is portrayed in the imagery. In the book, the government sometimes feels like an afterthought, because of the fact that the book mainly focuses on the people running the government rather than the government itself. In the movie, the government's presence is felt a lot more. The movie's imagery makes the government feel crushingly oppressive, whereas in the book the people just feel sort of downtrodden, which is different from oppression. The dark and oppressive atmosphere is almost palpable in the movie, and it's for that reason that the movie wins in my mind.
But now let's take a look at these two equally compelling but very different stories. This one's pretty hard to choose. Both stories are good, but as Alan Moore has pointed out, the movie took more than a few liberties with the story. The point of the graphic novel was basically to present both anarchy and fascism in an equal light without giving favor or disdain to either and allowing the audience to make its own judgment. So we see the government with its power-hungry officials but the sympathetic leader on the side of fascism, fighting the ruthless and murderous revolutionary and his sympathetic protege on the side of anarchy. Both sides commit atrocities, and yet at certain moments within the story, you feel sympathy for the cause of at least one of the characters involved. The movie's a little different. In addition to not having nearly as complex a plot as the book, the fight is also a little different. It's not a fight between fascism and anarchy so much as it's a fight between neoconservatism and leadership by the people, which is a much more relevant issue for the early 21st century American audience. While I like the book's glimpse at the two extremes, they are just that. Extremes. The book seems to be operating under the assumption that a government can only exist in fascism or in anarchy, with no middle ground. The movie gives us that middle ground. V is more of a freedom fighter than an anarchist, and his message has more to do with holding governments accountable rather than there being no government at all. In addition, while I find Moore's ability to balance the issue admirable, and while I appreciate that he doesn't tell his audiences what to think, I also appreciate that the movie does take a stand and shows us what lengths a government can go to in order to gain power.
It may also be worth mentioning that Alan Moore's stubborn refusal to let the story of the book out of his tight grip kind of negates his desire to keep from telling his audience what to think. But the book also puts a great deal of weight on this issue, and really examines and analyzes these two extremes. It's still very much a relevant cautionary tale of what can happen when certain styles of governing go too far. As we've said, the interplay between the various antagonists is fascinating, and the psychological development of the various characters is as well. There's not really any kind of closure to the story at all either, it just kind of stops, leaving you to think about the implications of what's just happened. It's definitely a thought-provoking story, and the movie has a tendency, as most movies do, to clean things up and make it a little more palatable. So it really comes down to this. Which is more desirable for this story? A more uncompromising and fascinating analysis of government? Or a more palatable and inspirational story about making governments accountable to their people? It really comes down to personal preference, and as far as we're concerned, the more palatable story is preferable. The movie still manages to bring a lot of gravity and weight to the story, while managing to appeal to a wider audience at the same time. The book is a lot grittier, and there are some truly unpleasant things that happen in the book. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it just means that less people are going to be able to enjoy the story. The story in the movie is ultimately more widely appealing. And when a story is making such a universal and broadly important point, I think that's for the best.